To me, as a tournament fisherman, a spinnerbait is one of those lures that I absolutely love. But whether you are a tournament angler or not, if you follow some of the tournament coverage like Bassmaster and Major League Fishing, it seems like if guys can get on a good spinnerbait bite these days, they're typically going to do extremely well in tournaments. It seems like when you get on a spinnerbait bite, you're catching some of the best quality fish that swim in your lake, reservoir, or even your pond.
Holy crap.
So this video is going to be a complete guide on how to catch bass on a spinnerbait. We're first going to talk about springtime spinnerbait and what I like to do in the spring to catch bass on a spinnerbait. Then we're going to talk about some of my favorite summertime techniques when it comes to fishing a spinnerbait. Then we're going to transition to fall and how fall fishing is just a little bit different when it comes to spinnerbaits. Then I'm actually going to show you how to step by step start skipping a spinnerbait so you can put that bait where no one else can. And then for those of you who like to build your own lures, I'm gonna show you how to build a spinnerbait. It's actually really simple to do. And then at the very end of this video, I'm gonna talk about the 5 biggest mistakes that anglers make with a spinnerbait, ones that you don't wanna make. So stay tuned. It's gonna be a good one. This video is brought to you by Omnia Fishing. Omnia Fishing is where I go to get all of my tackle. I also like using the Omnia app in the Pro subscription to be able to put different layers onto maps that really help me to go out and find bass. And really special offer right now at Omnia for about the next 4 or 5 days until February 27th. If you buy any fishing line at Omnia, you can get it for 25% off. So right now it's February. I highly suggest stocking up on your fishing line for the upcoming season, and you can save big bucks by using the coupon code 25line at checkout. So if you guys want to help support this channel, click that link for Omnia Fishing and shop there today. One of the best springtime lures is a spinnerbait. It catches a lot of fish and it can catch some of the biggest bass all year long during the spring. And today I want to talk about 3 mistakes that I see a lot of anglers make with a spinnerbait in the springtime. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Mistake number 1 when it comes to springtime spinnerbait fishing is not understanding the speed of your spinnerbait. This time of year, you hear a lot of guys talk about your blade configuration, and that is very important because depending on what water clarity you are fishing, whether that's very clear water or muddy water, you want a spinnerbait blade that's either gonna put off thump so the bass can feel it or flash so that they can see it from a distance. But something you don't hear a lot of guys talk about is the speed at which they fish a spinnerbait. A lot of guys are gonna go out there and they're simply going to just kind of fish a spinnerbait the way that they always do. They're gonna cast it at the bank and they're just gonna reel it back at kind of that same retrieve. And something that I have found to be extremely critical to do in the springtime is fish your spinnerbait a little bit slower than normal. As we're coming out of winter, the water that you're fishing might be really cold. I mean, it might be as cold as 45, 46 degrees that you're fishing a spinnerbait and all the way up to about 60 degrees. And what I found is that sometimes a slower spinnerbait, fishing a spinnerbait slower, can actually get you a lot more bites and a lot bigger bites. Now, whether you are fishing it up shallow, maybe around wood cover, or if you're fishing it kind of down a steeper bank and out a little bit deeper, I still like to fish it slower than I do pretty much the rest of the year. Now, something that can actually kind of help force you to slow down is by fishing a little bit lighter spinnerbait with a little bit bigger blades. For instance, here I have a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait that has a number 3 Colorado blade and a number 5 Colorado blade on it. Now, these blades are a little bit big for a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait. Usually I'm gonna use a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait a lot of times with this size of blades. But again, having a lighter spinnerbait, it forces me to slow down, because if I fish this bait too fast with that big of a blade, it will actually kind of kick the bait up in a weird way. So fishing those lighter spinnerbaits, sometimes it just forces you to slow down. So using a Colorado blade that catches a lot of water typically helps you to slow down. But if I'm fishing in really clear water in the spring with a spinnerbait, I typically like willow leaf blades. And again, I'm gonna use a smaller head. This is a 3/8 ounce head. And again, it just kind of forces me to slow that bait down. Now, this is actually one of my favorite spinnerbaits. It's a War Eagle spinnerbait, and I'll leave a link for the spinnerbaits and equipment that I talk about down below for you guys to check out. Another thing that can really kind of force you to slow down is by using a slower gear ratio reel, using something that is like a 5.2 to 1 gear ratio or something even in the 6 range. If you guys remember when Skeet Reese won the Bassmaster Classic on the Red River, he was actually using a reel that was a 5.4 to 1 gear ratio reel, and the only reason that he did that was to force him to slow down. The next mistake that a lot of anglers make while springtime spinnerbait fishing is not getting your spinnerbait in the nastiest, thickest cover that you can. You know, if you look kind of behind me here, these are the types of places that I love to throw a spinnerbait in during the springtime. It's this thicker wood cover, these bigger logs and things like that. And here's the thing, a lot of times in the springtime, you are dealing with muddy water, or at least pretty heavily stained water. And when you have muddy water, stained water, what it typically does is really kind of makes those bass hug up against cover. You know, for a human, if you are in a room and someone turns the light off and it is pitch black, you know, sometimes what we do is kind of like to get near a wall. That allows us to kind of gauge where we are in the room. And I think bass do the exact same thing in stained and muddy water, is they get right up against cover, whether that's logs, whether that's stumps, maybe it's even a rock bank. They're gonna get really close to that cover. So if you are fishing a spinnerbait and you are not getting it right in the cover, and I mean bouncing that thing off the cover, you may be missing out on a lot of fish, because in that stained and muddy water, those bass don't always want to shoot out and grab a bait from a distance. They're gonna stay kind of where they are, and you have to bring that bait to them. So it is so important to get that bait right up in the cover. Now, most spinnerbaits are going to come through wood cover pretty good, so you really don't have to worry about that bait getting hung up a lot. This particular spinnerbait is a Booyah Covert Series spinnerbait. It was designed by Jason Christie, who is one of the best spinnerbait bass fishermen in the world, if not the best. In my opinion, this is one of the best spinnerbaits to actually throw up in the wood cover because it comes through it extremely well. Now, when you are fishing really tight to wood cover, I don't like to throw a trailer hook on my spinnerbait. Instead, what I'm gonna do is thread on some sort of either swim bait type trailer like this, a little boot tail plastic, or a grub. Adding that plastic to your spinnerbait actually allows that bass to kind of have something to actually suck in when they go to eat that bait. It really draws that bait into their mouth. So that's why I always put plastic on when I'm fishing around heavy wood cover, and I take that trailer hook off because that trailer hook is going to get hung a lot. A lot of times when I am fishing tight to cover, I actually find it better to actually get kind of really close to that cover and actually pitch a spinnerbait around kind of a lot like you would a jig. And I actually like about a 7-foot rod when I'm doing this. It really allows me to make an accurate cast. This is an ARC Tharp Series hammer rod. It's 7 foot, it's medium heavy power. It's a perfect spinnerbait in my opinion. The third mistake that a lot of anglers make with a spinnerbait is not fishing painted blades. During the spring, this is one of the best seasons to fish a painted blade. Now, whether that's a little orange kicker blade like this, or a red kicker blade, or a pink kicker blade, I think that it is really important to fish these little red and orange kicker blades during the springtime. And the big reason is that bass kind of hone in on a reddish color during the spring. It is actually one of the best colors to fish. So adding a little red, a little orange, a little pink, I have seen it be the difference between catching fish and not catching fish. I was fishing a tournament with a buddy years ago, and we were using the exact same spinnerbait, same blades, except for I had an orange kicker blade on, where he just had your traditional gold Colorado blade on. During that day, I caught 6 or 7 bass on a spinnerbait, and he caught only 1 bass. When I first started getting into bass fishing, back when I was 12 and 13 years old, I remember fishing this one specific pond. Now, this pond had a humongous flat all against the bank, and then there was a drop off. And during the middle of summer, a lot of these fish would hang
on this drop off. But me being a bank angler at the time, it was very difficult for me to reach that drop off with a lot of different lures. Now, I'm not sure if you remember this one lure. It was called a rocket shad. And this rocket shad was basically like a mini spinnerbait that I could bomb way out to this little lip, and I would catch a lot of fish by actually burning that rocket shad just below the surface of the water. Now, several years later, I was actually up in Michigan and I was fishing a lake called Higgins Lake. It's an extremely clear body of water. It has a ton of smallmouth in it, and I was really struggling to catch a lot of fish. I was catching a ton of rock bass, but I was not catching a ton of smallmouth. And in that lake, we actually did a lot of swimming as well. And I actually remember seeing a ton of smallmouth that were kind of cruising down these different grass edges. And no matter what I tried in those areas, I couldn't really catch a fish. And for some reason, it reminded me of that little pond that I used to fish where I would catch fish on that rocket shad. And I didn't have any of those rocket shads with me, but what I did have was a spinnerbait. I started taking that spinnerbait and I would cast it over these grass clumps that were kind of hanging on these little lips, and I would burn this thing as fast as I could just below the surface of the water. And it was some of the most extraordinary fishing that I ever experienced. We caught a ton of big smallmouth, absolutely burning this bait back to the boat. And since then, I have started to burn a spinnerbait a lot. You know, it doesn't just work for smallmouth. You can catch largemouth with it, and you can catch spotted bass with it. In today's video, I just want to talk about burning a spinnerbait. Like I said, this is not a secret technique, but it's one that a lot of guys have just kind of stopped doing. I like to do this technique in clear water situations in the middle of summer. If I am fishing in the middle of summer, a lot of times bass are eating on really small young of the year shad or even really small minnows. And although your spinnerbait is a bigger offering, what they are attracted to is the blades of your spinnerbait. As you are really burning that spinnerbait just below the surface of the water, those bass can see that flash of that blade from a long distance away, and it looks just like one of those little shad. One of the most important things that you can do when it comes to actually fishing a spinnerbait and burning it is set your spinnerbait up for success. So let's dive into that right now. Now, there are several different spinnerbaits on the market that are actually intended to be used for this technique. I believe Strike King has a burner spinnerbait. Typically, these burner type spinnerbaits are a little bit heavier, usually at least 3/4 of an ounce, and they come with smaller willow leaf blades on them. Now, you don't absolutely need one of those spinnerbaits to be able to do this technique. For instance, a spinnerbait that I love to use this technique with is this simple War Eagle spinnerbait that I have right here. This is a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait. It comes with a number 3.5 and a 4.5 willow leaf on it. Now, another reason that I like that War Eagle is this particular one comes with a wire tied skirt on it. And when you are constantly burning this bait, you really want a bait that has a wire tie on it because it's going to help keep that skirt up. Now, anytime you are burning a spinnerbait, you really want to have both of these blades be willow leaf blades. You can burn a Colorado blade spinnerbait, and I've actually seen guys do that in muddy water situations, but I'm just not really familiar with that. So today, when I'm talking about burning a spinnerbait, I'm really referring to doing it in clear water and with willow leaf blades. Those willow leaf blades really send out a big flash where bass can see it from a distance, and you can bring that spinnerbait a lot faster through the water column because of those willow blades. Now, there's just a few modifications that I make to my spinnerbait when I am burning it, like this 1/2 ounce War Eagle spinnerbait. And one, I'm gonna simply kind of bend the blades so that they are closer to the head of the bait. That not only allows you to fish that bait a lot faster, but as that bass is approaching that spinnerbait, because your blades are so close to your skirt, I think that it really ensures that those bass actually eat your skirt and not necessarily your blades. The other thing I do with this spinnerbait is I trim the skirt up a lot. As you can see here, this skirt is pretty small. I actually like to trim the skirt just below the main hook of my spinnerbait. And then the last part that I'm gonna do, I actually add a treble hook as my trailer hook. I don't always fish trailer hooks on a spinnerbait. When I'm fishing it around wood cover, I almost don't even use a trailer hook. But when I am burning a spinnerbait like this, a trailer hook is a must. You're gonna have a lot of fish that hit the trailer hook. Now, the reason that I like a treble hook over a single hook is because you will see, especially smallmouth and spotted bass, they will hit this bait so hard at times with their mouth closed. And if you're using a single hook, I find that your hookup ratios can really be garbage. So using that treble hook, if a bass hits it with its mouth closed, a lot of times it will still get hooked somewhere near the mouth and you can still catch that fish. Now let's jump up on the front deck of the boat. I'm gonna show you a few keys to burning a spinnerbait that can help you to get a couple more bites. Now this is kind of a prime example of an area that I really like to fish when I am burning a spinnerbait. Out in front of me here, we have a big flat. It's a lot of grass and rock that's all in about 3 to 7 foot of water. This is a perfect example because there could be bass anywhere across this flat, and one of the best ways to effectively cover it is by burning this spinnerbait. Now, something that I really like to do, if you haven't noticed, my trolling motor is actually on right now. It is constantly moving. This just helps me to cover a lot more water, and I think that you will catch a lot more fish if your trolling motor is on constant speed all the time. Because if you've ever seen a carp in the springtime, when you're looking up shallow for fish, they will almost run into your trolling motor if you're at a constant speed. But if you are on that trolling motor and off of it and on it and off of it, you'll spook them when you're 50 feet away. And the same thing happens with bass. Now, when you are burning a spinnerbait, the retrieve is obviously pretty simple, but there are a few things that I like to do that I really feel like help me to get a few extra bites while doing this. So as you can imagine, I'm just gonna make a long cast with this bait out, and I'm basically gonna reel this bait just about as fast as I can. But if you notice here, every now and then as I'm bringing this bait back, I'm gonna pop the rod. You see that? I pop the rod and I just kill that bait for a split second. Pop it just like that. Doing that pop in that retrieve, I think that this is so key with not only a spinnerbait, but a number of different baits. When you cast it out there, a lot of times those bass are gonna see that bait come by and they're tracking it real hard, and all of a sudden you pop those blades, and what happens is those blades just kind of flare. They kind of go all over, they dance a little bit for that fish, and a lot of times if those bass are tracking that bait real hard and you do that, bam, that is when those fish will actually get it. So I always, every time I'm making a cast while burning a spinnerbait, I'm gonna pop that rod probably 4 or 5 times during the retrieve, just like this. Bringing it, pop. Bring it, pop. Just like that. I tend to not like to break the surface all the time. Well, that's not exactly true. There is one situation where I do like to break the surface. And what I mean by break the surface is when those blades actually come up out of the water. So if I cast right here and I'm bringing it, see how that just came out of the water like that? Those blades splashed on top of the water. That's what I mean by breaking the surface. Now, the situation where I actually like to break the surface with that spinnerbait is when you see bass that are actually blowing up on bait fish. If you see them blowing up on shad or small bait fish, that is actually when I do like to break the surface with my spinnerbait blade. And I think that that actually helps attract bass to you. Now, most of the time when I'm fishing this way, I don't always feel like the bass are super active. I am trying to cause a reaction strike from the bass. And I have seen it before, especially when I'm fishing for smallmouth, that you will have bass that are tracking that spinnerbait. They're right on the end of that spinnerbait. And I have had several times where I will break the surface and then all of a sudden I'll see those smallmouth just dive off to the side. It's like something about breaking the surface was just too much for that fish. They didn't like it and they stopped following it. But if you simply twitch the rod like we talked about earlier, where it just pops those blades, but those blades still stay under the water, that is a lot of times when they're going to get that bait. Another big key with this bait is your rod position. When you cast that bait out, a lot of times I'm gonna start with my rod fairly high like this, and I'm going to work it down as that bait gets closer and closer to me. The whole time that I am making this retrieve, I can visibly see the blades of my spinnerbait the entire time. So the reason that I start with the rod tip high like this is just to keep that bait high and not sinking too low. And as it gets closer and closer to me, I'm gonna lower that rod tip so that I don't break the surface.
Whoa. Here we go, baby. God, crush it though.
So like I said, guys, a spinnerbait is one of the best lures to use during the fall. As we know, a lot of bass, whether you're fishing for smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, spotted bass, they're all feeding up pretty heavily this time of the year, kind of preparing to go into winter. And especially if you live kind of in those mid to northern states, you really have a fall feed that tends to happen where these fish are going to be feeding a lot on bait fish. Now, whether you have shad in your lakes, or maybe you're fishing way up north where the fish are feeding on alewives or even bluegill, whatever it may be, guys, a spinnerbait can be a really, really good bait to use. You can cover a lot of water, you can fish it efficiently, and the thing about it is it catches some really big bass during the fall. And the other thing about a spinnerbait is it can work in pretty cold water. I've caught a lot of spinnerbait fish in the fall and even in the spring in that water temperature that's in the upper 40s. So right now I'm on the water today and the water is like 54 degrees and it's perfect. So the first tip that I want to give you guys really revolves around location, and location is really key when you're fishing a spinnerbait. There's a lot of lakes out there in the country that are kind of set up similar to the one that I'm fishing today. On the lower end of this body of water, you have pretty clean water where you have 4, 5, 6 foot of visibility. But on the upper end of this lake, where I am right now, you actually have lower visibility. It's only about a foot, maybe 2 foot at most, but a lot of the water that I'm seeing is about a foot visibility. The water isn't necessarily muddy, but it's just got that heavy stain to it. And this is the first tip, is that finding that stained water can really be key to catching bass during the fall on a spinnerbait. And it's not that you won't catch fish on a spinnerbait in clear water, it's just that I think that sometimes other lures like a jerkbait actually might work better than the spinnerbait. So what I really like to find is that off-color water. That off-color water just tends to keep those bass a little bit shallower, and that might keep them in that, 1 foot to 3 foot range where a spinnerbait is really just going to dominate. Now, along with finding that off-color water, another thing that you need to find is bait fish. In the lake that I'm fishing here, it's gizzard shad. That's what I'm looking for. And here's the thing, I actually did a video about this whole subject kind of, but in the fall, you tend to have bait fish almost everywhere. It can be deep, it can be shallow, it can be really everywhere. So something that I really like to do is find the bigger bait fish. If you can find those bigger threadfin shad or bigger gizzard shad, whatever it may be, maybe it's bluegill on your lake, those bigger bait fish tend to be where you find the quality fish. I got into this creek arm here and immediately I could see the bigger bait fish just from my electronics. And once I stood up on the front deck of the boat, they were coming up, they were pecking on the top of the surface, and you could tell they were the bigger ones, those 4 or 5 inch shad, as opposed to the really little 1 or 2 inch shad that are kind of everywhere. Tip number 2 when it comes to that fall time spinnerbait fishing is that I tend to catch a lot of bass around wood laydowns during this time of the year, or wood in general, whether that's laydowns, maybe it's stumps or standing timber. It just seems that the bass really relate to that wood kind of in that later fall, like I'm talking about when that water's in the 50s, high 40s. Now, I'm not saying you're not gonna catch spinnerbait on rocks or around grass if it's still left, but what I'm saying is I like to focus on wood a lot of times. And with that being said, the tip when it actually comes to fishing around that wood is instead of making longer casts, sometimes I think it is actually better to get really up tight to the wood itself and actually make a lot of small pitches to the wood. Come on, fish. Oh, that fish got wrapped around. I mean, that's the bad thing about fishing in all this wood like that is, you're gonna get some fish caught up in the brush from time to time. That fish wasn't huge. I thought I could just pull him around, but he
he obviously had other plans. You know, one thing that I love to do with the spinnerbait is pitch it, you know, like a jig. You know, I try to get that bait into areas that other guys aren't getting it, you know. And if I'm sitting out here over here, I can't really cast in behind this stuff. So getting up tight like you would if you were flipping a jig or a crawl of some sort, you can do the same thing, but you can throw a spinnerbait instead. And that's exactly what I just did over here where I had that fish just come off. But it's just something that a lot of guys don't always think about. I mean, there's no reason you can't pitch a spinnerbait or a moving bait like a vibrating jig or even a square bill. You can pitch a square bill around the same type of stuff. So
the thing is I'm trying to get my spinnerbait right up next to the wood. I'm trying to hit all different types of angles in the wood, every little high percentage area in that wood that I see. I'm trying to hit it with my spinnerbait. So sometimes getting really close up to the cover and actually making pitches with your spinnerbait can actually help you to get more bites because you're going to be hitting more high percentage areas. Now, with that being said, you have to be stealthy when it comes to this. You don't want to be running up like into the wood or kicking your trolling motor and blowing out the water. You want to be stealthy when you're really close to an object where a bass could potentially be.
oh my gosh, the same thing just happened again.
So the third tip is really about making multiple casts at those high percentage areas. I have seen this so many times, actually throughout the entire year. It's not just in the fall, but it definitely seems to hold true in the fall. If you get around, you know, a stump, you know, and I'm not saying you have to do this on every little twig that you see, but what I am saying is, as a fisherman, we all get to those little areas or we find those laydowns where you're just like, oh my gosh, there's a bass in there. There's absolutely a bass in there. In your mind, you're like, there's no way there's not a bass in there. And when you find those particular areas, like a really good laydown, as you can see right here behind me, if you have those areas, make multiple casts, even to the exact same spot. If you see, you know, where that limb comes down to the water, it kind of makes a V. A lot of times that's a high percentage area. Make 3-4 casts in there.
There it is.
Dadgum. There we go.
You know, the perfect analogy is when you're at home watching football and your little brother or your cousin or your son keeps running in front of the TV screen, constantly screaming his head off, and you're trying to watch the football game, right? Well, by about the 9th, 10th time, you're probably eventually going to say something. You're going to reach out, you're going to grab him and say, look, I'm trying to watch the game here, son. Can you go in the other room, okay? The same thing happens with a bass, right? But a bass can't reach out with its fin, but if you keep throwing that spinnerbait up in its face, you're constantly up in its face, eventually it's just got to reach out and bite that bait and you're going to catch that fish. So making multiple casts at the same target can be key to catch bass on a spinnerbait during the fall. When you hear guys talking about skipping a lure, most of the time they are referring to a jig or a soft plastic. And even videos that I have done on this channel, I'm typically skipping with a jig or a soft plastic. But a lure that a lot of guys don't think that you can skip is a spinnerbait. Now, the reason learning how to skip lures like a spinnerbait underneath docks or underneath overhanging trees is so important is because you are going to show fish that typically see soft plastics and jigs something that is a lot different. And when you show fish that always see the exact same thing, something different, that is going to help you to catch a lot more bass. But learning how to skip a spinnerbait is really all about the setup. So let's dive into the setup and show you exactly how to skip a spinnerbait right now. Now, in order to get a spinnerbait to skip, not only do you need to learn how to cast this bait, but you also want to add a bigger soft plastic to the bait. That soft plastic is what really allows that bait to skip across the water. Now, I'm gonna get into the soft plastic trailer that I like to use in just a moment here, but first I wanna talk about the spinnerbait. And knowing that we need a good soft plastic on our spinnerbait in order to skip it, that is why I choose this specific spinnerbait 9 times out of 10 when I go to skip it. This is the Berkley Power Blade. There are literally 100, if not 1,000 different brands out there that carry some sort of spinnerbait. And every single one of those spinnerbait brands, you're going to be able to skip with. But the big thing, and the reason that I like the Berkley Power Blade so much, is that the plastic keeper on this bait is phenomenal. It is a really good plastic keeper. It is a lot better than pretty much every other brand that I've tried. And I've tried a lot of different brands at keeping that plastic on. Now, you could always super glue your plastic on, and I do that from time to time as well. But the bad thing about super glue is if you're using a spinnerbait a lot and you're catching a lot of fish, you're gonna wear out that soft plastic, and then your super glue just continues to build up and build up, where then it actually doesn't hold very well at all. Now, on this Power Blade, you actually do not need to use any super glue at all. That is why I like this spinnerbait so much. Now, this is what it looks like when it comes out of the package. It's a 1/2 ounce spinnerbait that I'm using right now. I always like to trim up my skirt, and I'm going to trim it just below where this hook is. Now, if you can see, this hook actually hangs down a lot more on that blade, on the Power Blade, more than other spinnerbaits, which I actually really like, because I don't use a trailer hook when I'm skipping. I just use that soft plastic. And I'm gonna trim that skirt up just like I did here, right below where the hook is. Now, the next thing you wanna do is thread on your soft plastic. Again, this is the most important part of this system, because this is what allows this bait to skip. Now, this is the soft plastic that I use for my trailer on our spinnerbait. I'm not saying that you can't use other soft plastics. This is just the one that I use that works really well for me. Now, this is a 4.8 inch Kitech right here. Now, although it's 4.8 inches, I'm going to trim it down. And you might be asking, well, Tyler, why don't you just go with a 3.8 or a 3.3? And the biggest reason is I want a big, thick, soft plastic. This 4.8 inch is really thick. And so I want a lot of surface area there, because that's what allows that bait to skip a lot better. So I'm actually going to trim up, once I find my scissors, and I trim about 1 inch off the top, just like that. That is what I end up using for my trailer right there. So now I have my spinnerbait skirt trimmed up, I have my soft plastic trimmed up, and I'm simply going to thread this on to the spinnerbait. And the biggest key here is just making sure that this is as straight as possible. And I'm gonna feed it all the way up onto the hook, just like that. And that's it. That is how you set up a spinnerbait in order for it to skip. Now I'm gonna jump up on the front deck of the boat and show you exactly how I go about skipping this bait. Now, when it comes to skipping a spinnerbait, it's very similar to any other lure that you can skip. Probably the biggest difference that I have noticed is that I typically want a higher velocity when I'm skipping a spinnerbait over other lures. I really want this bait to be moving, because as you can see, if you look at a spinnerbait, there's just a lot of parts here. You got blades, you got wires, you got everything. So because there's so much for the water to catch, it's really best to have some speed to get that thing to skip the furthest. Now, with that being said, you wanna make sure that you have a quick thumb, because sometimes no matter how you set up a spinnerbait, it might hit blade first or wire first. It's going to just simply hit in a weird way. And if it hits in a weird way, it's not going to skip, and you're gonna wanna make sure that you stop your spool from spinning to prevent a big backlash. Now, I typically do an underhand roll cast. Sometimes you can do a pitch skip. It's hard to do it with the spinnerbait. As you can see, I skipped it a little bit right there. But an underhand roll is basically like I keep my line out about like this, and I do an underhand roll, just like that. That is your underhand roll cast. That gives me a lot of velocity in order to skip this bait. Now, the big thing with skipping a spinnerbait is feathering that spool with your thumb a hair before it hits the water. If you do that, you can really set that spinnerbait in the water very gently. And if you set it in there gently, it's going to skip a lot farther. If it comes just crashing down into the water, it's not gonna skip. So feather that spool, and we'll show you a couple of skips right here. I got a this is a perfect example of where I might wanna skip a spinnerbait. If you look here, I have a typical lay down, but you have a branch that's kind of coming out under the water. It's only about a foot above the water, but there's also a branch under the water. I'd love to hit that branch under the water from this angle. And so in order for me to do that, I got to skip it right up under there. So I'm just gonna skip it just like that. Start my, bam, I just hit that log underneath the water, which I wanted to hit. And now I'm going. That's a perfect example of why you want to skip a spinnerbait. They don't skip pretty. They don't always skip pretty, just like that one right there, but they will skip. Another part, like if you look way up under there, under that log, that is another place where that area doesn't see a lot of spinnerbaits. That's gonna see primarily Senkos and jigs, because no one wants to skip a spinnerbait or really anything like this up under there. So in order for me to really skip that bait, as you can see, it just skips really nice. And I got it way up under there. And now I am showing a bass something different than it is used to seeing. There might be a bass sitting up under that log that has seen 100 jigs, 100 soft plastics. But as soon as you show them something that's vastly different, like a spinnerbait, they are going to commit to that bait. And you can't put a spinnerbait up under there without skipping it. Now you can skip it kind of like a pitch skip, where I just kind of like do that, as you can see, but it takes a little bit more time to master that, I feel like, as opposed to just your underhand roll cast where you can skip it. I'm actually gonna show you guys real quick how I go about building a spinnerbait on the water. All right, guys, here is literally what I keep with me. It's my spinnerbait bag. I have a bunch of these boss heads like the ones that I have here. And you know, there's some 3/8 ounce ones, there's some 1/2 ounce ones. I have some that are more compact. So it's really quite simple. I'm just gonna pick out a head that I wanna use. I'm gonna make kind of a muddy water spinnerbait right now. So I'm gonna take this chartreuse head. This is a 3/8 ounce chartreuse head. I have a bunch of skirt material with me. This bait here is gonna be straight chartreuse as well. So I'm gonna pull out that skirt. I also have a bunch of blades in here. On this particular spinnerbait, I'm gonna put a gold willow leaf blade on there. And I'm also going to put a gold Colorado blade, a little bit smaller one on there. That's gonna be my spinnerbait setup. So there's most of the components that I need. I'm also gonna need beads, swivels, and clevis. There we go. First thing I'm gonna do is put this Colorado blade on. So basically I put the clevis through my Colorado blade, put it on my spinnerbait shaft just like that. I want this cupped in to be facing towards the wire just like that. The next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put 4 or 5 beads on the wire. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, there is the start of the spinnerbait. I'm gonna lay that down. Next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take out one of these spinnerbait swivels and I'm going to attach my willow leaf blade to it. All right, now we got the swivel on there. I'm gonna put that down for a minute. Grab a pair of pliers and I'm just gonna roll the wire at the top around my pliers, kind of making a small loop, if you can see that right there. I'm gonna go ahead and put my blade on and then I'm just gonna kind of crimp that loop tight. After that, I'm simply gonna take my skirt and feed it up on the spinnerbait. And there we go, guys. A great muddy water spinnerbait. The first big mistake that I believe a lot of anglers make with a spinnerbait is primarily fishing that bait shallow. I think even if you look at this entire video, I have pretty much talked about fishing it pretty shallow. And yes, it is a great shallow water bait, but you can fish spinnerbaits in really deep water. There are a number of different brands out there on the market that make spinnerbaits that are an ounce and a half. 2 ounces even. And actually putting a spinnerbait in a place that bass normally don't see it, kind of like I've talked about throughout this video, is a very effective way at catching highly pressured bass. So to me, I like to fish those really big spinnerbaits in offshore cover and structure situations where you don't normally fish them. For example, a brush pile. You know, we've actually seen guys like Jacob Wheeler and Dustin Connell kind of utilize this technique over the last few years of fishing big spinnerbaits over deeper brush piles. And it seems like they are catching sometimes the biggest bass that swim. And not only that, you can also fish it out there on ledges. If you live on a lake where ledge fishing is a big deal, maybe like a Kentucky lake or a Gunnersville or any lake out there where you're fishing offshore, there's a lot of guys when they fish offshore, they're picking up deep diving crankbaits. They're picking up, you know, jigs or big worms or Carolina rigs. There's not a lot of guys picking up a spinnerbait. Again, throwing something different where fish don't usually see it is a really good way at catching those highly pressured bass. Now, mistake number 2 when it comes to fishing a spinnerbait is not imparting action on that bait. I have talked about this throughout the video, but I really want to just push it a little bit further because I think that it is that much more important. I think a lot of anglers, especially if you are new to bass fishing, it's so easy for us to grab that spinnerbait, cast it out there, and literally just reel it in. Just reel it in at the exact same pace. And yes, you are going to catch fish from time to time doing that, especially if you're fishing in, you know, maybe smaller bodies of water where bass haven't seen a lot of spinnerbaits. You're going to go out there and you're going to be able to catch fish. But once you start getting into, again, highly pressured bodies of water or areas of the country where spinnerbaits are really popular, I think that it is that much more important to impart a little bit of action on your bait. And not only to be different, but also as a simple trigger mechanism. I talked about this in the video, but there are a lot of times where we don't know it as an angler, but bass are following our baits. They are following them. And with the advancements of technology like forward-facing sonar, this is something that I actually see a lot. And so what I have found with the spinnerbait is simply just popping that blade. So as I'm reeling it in, I'm just gonna stop it and pop it real quick. It makes those blades just kind of shoot out all over the place. And if you have a bass that is tracking it, whether you're using forward-facing sonar or not, sometimes that will make a bass commit to a bait. It's a change of speed, it's a change of pace, it's something that is just a trigger mechanism. So anytime I'm out there fishing a spinnerbait, I always like to impart just a little bit of action into that bait, simply popping that rod. Now, another thing that you can do is actually just hit that bait off of the cover. The good thing about a spinnerbait is it is a very weedless bait. You can hit it into the grass and get it hung up in the grass and pop it free. You can hit it up against a rock. You can actually creep it right through wood and it's not even going to get hung up. And simply making that bait hit on the cover, bounce off of that cover, again, kind of like those blades popping, this is a trigger mechanism for a bass. If they are tracking that bait, they will eat it because they just have to. It triggers a response, an innate response in them to eat. So anytime I'm fishing a spinnerbait, any time of the year, I always like to impart a little action on that bait. Now, with that being said, this actually brings me to mistake number 3 that I see some anglers make, and that is fishing a spinnerbait on too light of line. The good thing about a spinnerbait is the size of line that you're using really doesn't impact the way that that spinnerbait kind of comes through the water. For a lot of other lures, the size of line that you use actually does impact that bait quite a bit. You know, if you're using a crankbait, for example, if you cast a 10-foot diving crankbait on 12-pound line, it's probably gonna get to about 10 foot deep. But if you cast it on 20-pound line, it may only get to about 6 or 7 foot deep. All the drag from that line really keeps that crankbait from kind of getting to its maximum depth. If you're using a Texas rig, you know, a simple Texas rig, if you fish it on really heavy line, 20-pound line versus, you know,
15-pound line or 14-pound line, that bait, if you watch it underwater, it looks way more natural when you're using those lighter lines. So that tends to help you get more bites. But when it comes to a spinnerbait, you most of the time, no matter what size of line that you are using, the spinnerbait's not really doing anything that different. That different enough to me that's going to cause a bass to not eat it or eat it. So anytime I fish a spinnerbait, I fish it on big line. I really do. I always fish a spinnerbait on 20-pound fluorocarbon. And I know that that may sound like a lot to some of you guys out there, but like I talked about earlier, there are so many times where I'm trying to hit a spinnerbait up against cover and get it in that cover. So having that 20-pound line to me is really, really important, because if you hook into a 5, 6, 7-pound bass and he is way up underneath of a dock, or maybe he is underneath of an overhanging tree, him kind of digging himself into that tree and making that line go across the wood or whatever it may be down there, it's going to severely fray that line. So I like having 20-pound line, because if I'm using 10-pound line and throwing a spinnerbait and that fish does that same thing, he's probably going to break the line. So I always use heavy line. I think it's really important that you use heavy line as well. Now, mistake number 4 is a little bit less of a mistake and more or less just a tip. I've talked about in this video how I like to use a plastic piece of trailer on the back of a spinnerbait as opposed to a trailer hook. And guys, there's a lot of people out there who like to use a trailer hook. And I'm not going to say that using a trailer hook is not going to help you out there. You know, like if it works for you, I always tell people if it's working for you, then just continue to do it. Now, I like to use that plastic, and I like to use it for a number of different reasons. I think it helps make that kind of draw that bait into the fish's mouth. It's also a lot more weedless when you're throwing it right next to cover. But like I talked about when I talked about burning a spinnerbait, I use a trailer hook in that situation, a treble hook in that situation. So I don't want to completely deter you from using trailer hooks. I just want you guys to know that that's why I do it. And if you guys like the trailer hook, then by all means, keep fishing a trailer hook. Now, tip number 5, and this is actually a very, very important one, is that there are days out there on the water where actually using a chatterbait is a little bit better suited than using a spinnerbait. There are conditions, there are situations I've seen out there on the water where a chatterbait is simply better to use than a spinnerbait. And sometimes breaks my heart. But anyways, I did a full video just like this one here, where I talked all about chatterbait fishing. Everything you need to know right here. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I think you will like this one as well. I will see you guys in the next one.